Thank you all for joining us. I am Sarah Lasser with the Aspen Chamber Resort Association. We appreciate you being here today. And pleased to introduce the engineering team from the City of Aspen, who will do a bit of a formal presentation. Then we'll move into a bit of a moderated discussion with the team, and then shift back to one-on-one Q&A, looking at the poster boards and one-on-one with the engineering team. So I'd like to introduce Trish Aragon, PJ Miller, and Pete Rice. And thanks so much for being here today and connecting with our ACRA members and our business community. And I'll turn it over to you all to take it away. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. My name is PJ, and I'm the project manager for the Safety and Mobility in the Downtown Core project. I want to start by just giving my appreciation to all of you for taking time out of your mornings to come and hear about this project and to provide us with feedback as we move forward. Before we get started in the presentation, I want to give you a roadmap.
PJ, can I just, I wanted to also say welcome to our new City Hall and our new council chambers. Although Ward is jealous that he wasn't able to do the inaugural meeting himself, I just want to welcome you to our new facility here.
So a little bit of a roadmap for today. We have quite a bit of information to present to you all. And so we'll start with the background and history of the project. Then we'll talk through the existing conditions in the core. We'll talk about where we are in the process and what our outreach plan is. Then I'll show you our proposed concept for the Living Lab, which I'm sure many of you have seen. It's been up on the screens this morning. That will cover the conceptual modifications to the right-of-way, to the infrastructure, as well as programmatic and mitigation measures that will be implemented with the Living Lab. And then we will have the presentation followed by a moderated Q&A. Sarah will ask some questions that have been submitted by ACRA members. So that will follow, and then it'll go back to the open house format after the moderated Q&A for you all to ask any follow-up questions and give additional feedback. Okay, so everyone in this room has been on this street before. It's Galena, and it's a great representation of why a lot of people enjoy our downtown. It has one of the best views of Ajax. You can walk through here on your way to shops, to restaurants, to visit the ped malls. It's really a great place that bustles with locals, commuters, and tourists that navigate our downtown core by foot, bicycle, or vehicle. And you business owners help create that experience that's so unique to Aspen. And in its existing condition, the right-of-way in downtown Aspen is dedicated primarily to vehicles. And so you can see on this slide with this space allocation bar along the bottom that 70% of the right-of-way is dedicated to cars. That leaves the remaining 30% to pedestrians with the sidewalks on either side of the street. On Galena in particular, there is no specific infrastructure for bicyclists. On Galena, the bicyclists share the lane with vehicles similar to Hopkins and Durant. And because of this condition of prioritizing vehicles in our downtown core, staff and council have received feedback from the community that the core feels unsafe to navigate. So staff was directed by council to explore how right-of-way space could be allocated differently and that to increase safety for the traveling public. By improving the routing and the infrastructure for all modes of transportation, the safety is indirectly increased. And that means when pedestrians and bikers have designated use areas like sidewalks and bike lanes, cars are better able to anticipate their movements. There's expectation there, and then safer interactions can occur when you know where a bicyclist is going to be. So from this feedback we've received from the community, the Safety and Mobility in the Downtown Core project was developed, and it has three main goals. The first goal is to increase safety for all users, including pedestrians and cyclists. The second goal is to improve mobility and connectivity in the downtown core. And the third goal is to prioritize transit and/or shared mobility options over the use and storage of single occupancy vehicles. These goals can be achieved when the right-of-way space is dedicated to each user respectively. So originally, in early 2021, staff presented the streets highlighted on this slide to council as candidates for safety improvement projects. These areas have been identified in previous master plans and studies where routing, connectivity, and infrastructure could be improved. We've also heard that these areas in the core are from feedback from the community members of areas where safety could be improved as well. The feedback we received from council in early 2021 is that for any improvements to be implemented, they should be made incrementally and in a step-by-step approach, but also be part of a holistic plan for the downtown core. So having a holistic plan means that the improvements expand beyond just the intersection boundary. We have seen intersection improvement projects completed in town. An example that was a living lab this year was the intersection of Spring and Cooper near City Market. And so this project is to expand the benefits into the roadway and in between the intersections. When we presented to council the second time, we presented a menu of safety improvement measures that could be paired together to improve the overall safety. And this is an experiment to test these standardized safety measures in our town to see what works. This menu included things that we're familiar with, such as curb extensions, widened pedestrian areas, improved sight lines, shorter crosswalk widths, protected bike lanes, converting parking from head-in to parallel parking, and that improves visibility between vehicles and cyclists. And an option was even to transition to a vehicle-free corridor. So this menu just provided a starting point for us to gather feedback on what is supported, what measures should we implement and test. So with the direction that the project should be incremental and step-by-step, staff determined that implementing improvements on a single corridor would be the first step. So Galena and Cooper was chosen for the living lab. And a living lab is what we're calling the implementation and testing of temporary measures. So that the success can be measured, we can gather feedback, and also any modifications necessary for the design can be made prior to any permanent installation of improvements. Galena and Cooper were chosen because it is currently a one-way street. It has the greatest room for improvements due to head-in parking on both sides of the street, and existing transit routes already use this corridor. So the downtowner as well as Galena Street Shuttle use this area. This reduced the scale of the project from 3 corridors down to 1. So to support moving forward with the living lab in this corridor, Galena and Cooper, I wanted to share some incidents reports over the last 5 years. So some important things to note on this slide are that the number of accidents is certainly an indicator that safety can be improved. But near misses is also a really great indicator that safety is a concern. Near misses typically are not reported through the police department, and that is where this data is coming from. We hear as staff and council of these near misses of people feeling unsafe, but they're not necessarily reported in this data. Incidences, so another thing to note is that incidences are happening at intersections, and you can see that on this map, but they're also happening in between the intersections. And so that's again why this holistic approach is so important. It's to start to provide safety along the street, not just at intersections. And the last thing to note is just a few things about bicyclists. So bikers are quickly able to maneuver away from incidences. They have much greater visibility than vehicles do because they don't have a car in front of them. Their bike is much smaller. So you can see that the numbers here of incidences involving bicyclists are low, but that is because, again, they quickly can maneuver. But when an incident involving a biker does happen, it's often severe and damaging. And it does not mean that dedicated space in the right-of-way should not be provided for this user. Pedestrians versus bicycle incidences are not shown because we have not had any reports filed of that type of interaction. I'm going to pass it to Pete to talk about our community outreach.
Thanks, PJ. So, as most of you know, we've met a few times with ACRA. This started last year when council asked us to look at safety improvements in the core. And most of you have been in the core and understand the reasons council's asking that question. We've worked with council through the spring and summer. We did a short survey that was provided at that time just to the general community to dip your toe in the water and see where we are as a community. Continued to work with council, and then we started to begin the discussions with your group. We started with a few board members for the first meeting, kind of worked into the directly impacted businesses, and now we're starting with the rest of the business community. And as this continues, in a couple weeks, we are going to start the more comprehensive outreach program that goes to the general public. I would ask all of you to fill out the surveys because those will be seen directly by council. Anything you say in that, and we're going to record that very closely. And we have a feeling we'll have a great turnout for this program. So we'll spend the next 2 months working on this outreach. I do want to continue the dialogue with the business community, and we'll have separate events that'll continue up, like pop-ups, the focus groups, and in the next couple months, we're going to try to get all the community info on where that is at, and come back to council in February and see where it's headed. Council ultimately will make that decision. And I just wanted to kind of go through a couple slides that several of you have seen that we did do in the summer survey. So as you can see, the modes are not vehicle dominated. As you would expect, there's a lot of pedestrians in the core that do walk into the core a few blocks, and bicycles are a heavy percentage. And right now, as PJ said, our roads are designed primarily for vehicles. The other thing that was interesting about this survey is how many people feel uncomfortable in all modes of vehicles, within bikes, vehicles. The reason that people feel uncomfortable in vehicles is you're driving down that roadway, your vision is limited. You know, it's not comfortable with pedestrians walking from the mall. It's not comfortable interacting with the bicyclists that are down that road. So that's why that statistic shows that drivers are not comfortable either. And the last ones are support of changing kind of the roadways. There's different facets of this, but you can see that the original survey definitely showed some kind of pilot programs, if they'd be interesting in changing incrementally the downtown core. And as you can see, there was a lot of favorability to both of those questions.
Okay, so now we'll talk about the proposed improvements on the Galena-Cooper corridor. And this is what we're calling the Living Lab. So there's a couple of components to this Living Lab that I want to just highlight. Again, it's a little bit of this roadmap. So there's infrastructure modifications, and those are changes to the physical appearance of the corridor. Those are things like striping and parking configuration. We also will talk about in the following slides about mitigation measures and programmatic changes, and those are changes to the way existing programs are run, or kind of these softer changes that you won't necessarily see in the roadway. This photo simulation shows the first incremental steps in increasing safety by modifying the parking configuration to allow for space to be allocated differently to pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure. So you can see we have parallel parking on both sides of the street, and this helps to reduce poor interactions between cyclists and parked cars as they pull out of parking spaces, and vehicles and parked cars as they pull out of parking spaces. The space gained is then converted to the counterflow protected bikeway for cyclists biking the opposite direction of traffic, and also to widened or increased pedestrian areas. Cyclists traveling with the flow of traffic will share the drive lane, and that's again similar to Hopkins or Durant. This application, or this cross-section, is very similar to what we see outside the Wheeler Opera House currently, and that was installed as a temporary condition as part of construction, but will become permanent. Again, very similar to this, if you want to see it already installed somewhere. In addition to the improvements I just mentioned, we are looking and recommending that the turning motions at Galena and Hyman be modified. So in the upper left corner, that's Ute Mountaineer, and then you have Kai Davis Fountain along the bottom there, just to orient you all. And by removing this left turn onto Hyman, it simplifies the intersection. And it helps to remove potential conflict between drivers and pedestrians specifically here. With the removal of this left-hand turn, Hyman can then become a one-way street for the single block here. Okay, now let's talk about parking, which is what I'm sure most of us are ready to dive into. So the first thing I want to talk about is what the opportunity is here around parking. And it is to shift our thinking from total number of spaces to spaces being available. And the number of spaces in the downtown core plays a role in one's ability to drive downtown and find a parking space. But it doesn't matter to that person if there's 20 spaces available or only 2. What matters is that one spot is open for them to park. So we need our spaces to be available, and we can address that through programming. As part of the Living Lab, the first part that I'll talk about is the mitigation. And so the orange boundary here is the commercial core parking area. And it is being proposed that we reclassify parking spaces that are either currently in the commercial core boundary or slightly adjacent to it to core parking spaces. And this generates 47 core parking spaces by doing this. Examples are like at location A, there's 12 spaces here that are residential, but it's technically in the core, so reclassifying those. And then you can see the rest of them. And that is on a map over here if after the presentation you want to look at it closely. Okay, the second piece, again, is the availability of parking spaces, and that is the turnover of parking spaces. And when that is increased, and when we find a way to use underutilized spaces in the core, parking is available for people to drive downtown and find somewhere to park. So looking at this slide, I'll do a little bit of an explanation here. So this is our daily parking occupancy, and I'll start with the green line. Those are the 2019 average daily occupancy, and then the blue is 2021 daily average occupancy of the parking in the downtown core. The red line is the 85% target threshold. So that means that the goal is to have 15% of parking spaces in the core available and empty for people to use. And that is a current goal of the parking department. And during the lab, we are proposing that we work to maintain that 85% target threshold with similar data points as 2019 and 2021. So that's the table here on the left. That is, in 2019, we had 44 days where we were parked above 85% target threshold, and in 2021, that was 19 days. So what this means is that there is parking available in the core most of the day, most days of the year. 1 p.m. tends to be the busiest time in the core. Peak periods are summertime, which is not a surprise to any of us, and also the holidays. These are averaged data points, and so there are days where we're reaching 100%. This, again, an average, so it's not showing it that way. What this is also showing is that there's been behavioral shifts between 2019 and 2021. The decrease, the lower line, is showing that people are changing behavior, and we're seeing a decrease in parking in the core. We understand that parking is important, which is why we're looking at this availability piece. Okay, let's see, next slide. Okay, so the additional programmatic changes that are being explored is things like enhancing the existing valet parking program, looking at progressive timing based on the location in the downtown core. So areas that are of high demand, perhaps you are able to stay for a shorter amount of time, say 2 hours rather than the current 4 hours. The average stay in the downtown core is about an hour and a half. We can also look at progressive fees based on location. So the high demand locations in the core perhaps have higher hourly rates. And as you move over these high demand areas, either the time increases, you can have that 4 hour max, or perhaps the fees decrease. We're also looking at limiting construction parking in the living lab area during the duration of the living lab. And then another thing that we are looking at is additional pickup and drop-off locations within the core near high use areas such as banks, pharmacies, those types of things. And this is what's really important for your feedback. When we send out the survey, it's really important to hear from the business community on what parking availability program is favorable. And so that's why this survey will be really important when we send that out.
So I'm talking about a little bit of the transportation mitigation. And the good news is we have a great transportation system in town already. But what we can do now is we can start to improve upon those steps. We can start to look at the downtowner that focuses in this core and the garage and spaces where we do want the cars to be parking primarily, and then getting those services to focus on the core a little bit more. So we're going to start out with the extra downtowners that are waiting in specific locations where most of the people want to use that transportation. And then utilize some other options with possibly the Galena shuttle. Hopefully the public has some input on this, and then look at that last mile and start to work on these pieces to start and improve it, where you're not as reliant on a vehicle to get in front of the store as you would be by using something like the downtowner. Next steps. As I said before, we really want to continue working with this group, and we want to hear and present everything fairly to council. We're going to have an overall pop-up events for the general public. We're going to have the survey on the Aspen Community Voice starting in a couple weeks that will give everybody the opportunity for input. And as well, we'll track all these events and we'll present it to council in February. So we're excited to be working with everybody and continuing forward.
So again, I just want to reiterate that in order to improve safety in the right-of-way in the downtown core, safe, dedicated space or infrastructure must be provided for each user. And in the current condition, our vehicles are heavily prioritized, and this is an opportunity to shift that priority and start to balance it and be representative of the community that does walk and bike through the downtown core. And it is a bit of a balancing act to provide adequate space here. So that's why we're proposing mitigation techniques and programmatic changes that will help to create a well-rounded living lab that addresses the concerns here. And the concept that we presented, this concept from today, is really the concept that best balances the priority. So we've looked at a few other concepts prior to this one or alongside this one, and there was a slight prioritization on either pedestrians or bicyclists. So this one really was our balance here of priority. So with that, that is the end of our presentation. Thanks for hanging in and sitting here with us, and we'll move into the question and answer moderated discussion with Sarah.
Great. Thank you, everyone. We do have a few questions that have been brought to us by our ACRA members. Again, thanks so much for being here today. And thank you to the team for providing that overview and that context for this safety and mobility project. What other safety measures has the city considered throughout the course of this project in the commercial core where we have so much activity? Commercial deliveries, customers moving between businesses, visitors, locals, everyone interacting and moving about this commercial core area.
So questions we commonly get are, what about stop signs being installed or speed tables to be installed? So with stop signs, one reason you don't see these proposed necessarily as part of this living lab is that the stop signs need to be warranted based on traffic volumes, pedestrian volumes. You need to have a report stamped and signed by a engineer that says that this intersection requires a stop sign. And so there's more of a process there, which is why we are looking at infrastructure changes that allow for the priority to be balanced rather than just installing stop signs. As for speed tables, we have not recorded speeding issues in the core, and speed tables are also only effective at speeds greater than 25 miles an hour, which we do not see in the downtown core. So they would not be an effective treatment here for improving safety. We've also, like I mentioned, explored 2 other concepts. So we explored 3 total concepts. This one was the best balance. The other 2, like I mentioned, started to prioritize bicyclists a little bit more. We were playing with the parking configuration there. And so either we started to prioritize bicyclists or we were creating some unsafe or less than ideal conditions for cyclists. So this was our preferred and recommended option.
Well, regarding bicycles, we have seen in Aspen significant increase in bikers, especially e-bikes in our community. And when we talk about safety, there's a lot of conversation from our local businesses that bikes are going the wrong direction in the commercial core. Can you touch again on how this dedicated bike lane in this living lab will address those concerns?
So, like you just said, we know the bikers are going down to Galena because it's the connection. It's the connection through Mill. It's where people are going to be going. So what you try to do is you design around where the people are going. This protected bike lane, significantly improves bicycle and vehicle safety. This will allow that extra space for a biker to feel safe and comfortable going through the core, and the vehicle also increases that. That barrier there provides that extra protection.
And I know you referenced in front of the Wheeler Opera House that there's already an example living lab that's going to become permanent. Will you be adding those barriers on that street as well, like you have in this example?
The future goal is to do that. Right now, that is going to continue. People have really liked having that roadway the way it is, and then just like every street in the town, we assess it. How can we improve the safety on this street? And right now, we are assessing in the assessment phase on that street for additional safety features.
We have also heard from our ACRA members that enforcement is key to a safer downtown experience for all users. How will enforcement be integrated into this project?
Enforcement. We've heard a lot from this community about increased enforcement. It's really important to remember that to really create a safe downtown and a safe corridor on a roadway, you shouldn't rely on enforcement. The infrastructure should be safe in itself. People should feel comfortable driving in a safe way where they don't feel like a pedestrian's going to walk out and they can't see them. Police aren't going to correct that with enforcement. So we try to fix the infrastructure so you don't need that reliance on enforcement.
We have seen you outline both infrastructure, we just touched on that enforcement component. What is the city's education strategy for these different mobility groups, cars, pedestrians, and cyclists?
Okay, we've heard you last time, and we've heard from the community in general. A lot of it is on bicycle safety and people not understanding the rules. So we did take action this fall, and we are starting up we're restarting up the Street Smart program, which was an educational program that I think we started 4 or 5 years ago. We kind of took a hiatus during COVID, but we advertise, we get out to the Saturday markets, we start to communicate what the rules are, make sure they understand the stop signs, the yields, and make sure they understand the green boxes. So we hit it this way with an educational program. The other pieces that we're working on now are code related. So the Parks Department and Engineering are working on code related things that include, bells required, lights required at night. We're looking at speed limits on the trails. And we're also exploring the idea of requiring a safety video to be watched prior to renting an e-bike for the trails. That doesn't necessarily impact the downtown core, but those are some of the code changes that we're looking at bringing forward to not only educate bicyclists to make sure that they're aware of the road safety features, but improve everybody's safety.
Following up to that, if you don't have enforcement, how will the code change? how do you anticipate seeing improvements if there's no enforcement of bike lights and bells?
So there is enforcement.
Okay.
We don't rely on enforcement. There's two different, on Rio Grande Trail, we hear, the speeding. They have rangers that are specifically on that trail that you probably see if you're on the trail quite a bit. They enforce those type of issues. The police are very strategic on where, the community can request it. The police are strategic about their enforcement, and they are out there, and they will know the code changes. Well, I wouldn't say that they're going to crack down hard on bells, but it is something that police are going to remind citizens. You should have a bell for safety reasons, and they'll probably, just like they do now, they do have discussions with pedestrian and bicyclists. They're out in the community, and that's how they handle that.
Speaking about the parking programming and the availability piece, how will this Galena Living Lab communicate as part of the lab the parking availability and how that kind of shift in programming to find available parking versus just empty space? Cars do circulate more when they cannot find an empty space. So how, within this living lab, will you actually communicate how the programming has changed for all of these different user groups?
Well, certainly, anytime we're talking about bike education, we can incorporate all of this in the living lab. Any information that we put out to the public as part of the Street Smarts program can also communicate some of these changes. There will be signage changes in the downtown core that help communicate what parking changes have occurred, different signage. So if there's new zones created or different timing limits, those will be changed out in the core. As far as creating or encouraging people to park in underutilized areas, that if we go with a progressed timing or a progressed fee, people will see the signage in the core to start to understand that.
And can you share some of your measures of success for this living lab, and then how will those metrics be utilized in decision-making for the project?
So success will certainly be based on feedback from the community. So any surveys that we have that come out during the lab implementation will be really important. Of course, what we're looking for is an increase in people feeling safe while using the downtown core. But what we're also going to be looking at is a decrease in unsafe interactions between users. So by implementing infrastructure like this, we're starting to implement and start to use this national campaign called Vision Zero, which is a campaign for zero accidents involving pedestrians and bicyclists. But in order to work towards Vision Zero, you need to have the infrastructure that is safe and dedicated to each user in order to achieve this. And that allows, again, for the predictable interactions, for expectations to be set there. So those are our success measures.
Thank you. What else can you share with us today for our ACRA members that will be beneficial for them to know about this safety and mobility project?
Well, a few things that I want to touch on is just about how unique Aspen is for our cycling community. Over the last handful of years, we've seen such an increase in our biking population for commuting and also for enjoyment. What I want to highlight is just such a wonderful trail system that we have that brings cyclists and pedestrians as well into town. We have Rio Grande, we have the airport trail east of Aspen, all of these great arteries that come right into town. And it's a great way to get out and enjoy and see the views. We also are ranked on a gold level according to the League of American Bicyclists. So Aspen has earned that ranking based on our infrastructure for cycling. And then the last thing that I want Trish to touch on is the Safe Step program.
So Aspen is one of the unique communities in Colorado, although not the only one, that has adopted, it's called the Stop is Yield law. And this is more recently known as a safety stop. And many people ask what this is and what it means for this community. And what this law does, and it's been in force now for, I believe, over 5 years, but it recognizes the difference between vehicles and pedestrians. I mean, and bikes. So vehicles are not the same as bikes. We all know that. But if bikes are required to stop at every intersection, that means that they are putting themselves at risk. That's the most risky behavior, is to slow down your momentum at a bike, because that's when a bike becomes unstable. And then to regain that momentum. So at intersections is where bikes become their most vulnerable state. Whereas a vehicle, a stop is a stop. It doesn't impact the vulnerability of a vehicle. So what this law says is that as you're entering an intersection as a bike, you need to slow down, and you need to look at your intersection. And if there's a vehicle in that intersection that has the right of way, you need to allow that vehicle the right of way, or pedestrian. Then you can proceed through the intersection. So this allows us to create this more bike-friendly community. So it's not enough to say you're a bike-friendly community. You need to put actions behind that. And this law is one step towards making us a bike-friendly community.
Great, well, thank you so much. Appreciate you all presenting to our ACRA membership today. We'll now break back into the one-on-one Q&A, so everyone has an opportunity to ask questions of Trish, PJ, and Pete specific to what's on your mind. And I appreciate you all being here today as well. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.